The morning sun cast long shadows across Ouagadougou as President Ibrahim Traoré reviewed intelligence reports at his mahogany desk, the familiar sounds of Burkina Faso's capital filtering through his office windows. Street vendors called out their wares in melodic French and Moor. Children's laughter echoed from nearby schools, and the steady rhythm of a nation rebuilding itself provided the soundtrack to his morning routine. At 34, Ibrahim carried the weight of leading a country that had endured more coups than most nations experience in a century. Yet his eyes held the sharp intelligence of a man who had studied both warfare and philosophy with equal dedication. His aide, Aminata Ouedraogo, knocked softly before entering, her usual confidence replaced by an expression of curiosity mixed with concern. She carried an ornate envelope that seemed oddly out of place in their modest headquarters, a building that Ibrahim had deliberately kept simple to remind himself and his staff that power should serve the people, not impress visitors. The gold embossing caught the morning light as she placed it carefully before him, the expensive paper standing in contrast to the functional simplicity of his office. "Monsieur le Président," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned to recognize significant moments. "This arrived through diplomatic channels this morning. The British ambassador personally delivered it with unusual urgency." Ibrahim's weathered hands, scarred from years of military struggle and marked by the calluses of manual labor he had never abandoned despite his position, carefully opened the invitation. The prestigious Cambridge University seal stared back at him, embossed in gold that probably cost more than most Burkinabe families earned in a month. The institution was requesting his presence at their annual Global Leadership Symposium, where he would address the future of African governance alongside other world leaders. The timing seemed more than suspicious. It felt orchestrated. Just 3 months after his bold speeches about Western exploitation had gone viral across social media platforms, generating over 100 million views and sparking global conversations about neo-colonialism, this invitation arrived like a chess move from an opponent he had never directly engaged. His eyes narrowed as he read between the formal diplomatic language, sensing the underlying challenge hidden within the courteous words and academic protocols. Cambridge University cordially invites His Excellency President Ibrahim Traoré to participate in our distinguished symposium on global governance challenges. Your unique perspective on contemporary African political developments would provide valuable insights to our international audience of scholars, diplomats, and policymakers. Ibrahim set down the invitation and walked to his window, gazing out at the flag of Burkina Faso fluttering proudly in the morning breeze. Its red, white, and green stripes were more than mere colors. They represented the blood of martyrs, the peace his people sought, and the hope that sustained them through decades of foreign interference. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory with crystalline clarity. When the hyena invites the lion to dinner, the wise lion brings his own meat. The weight of representation pressed upon his shoulders, like the Atlas carrying the world. Every word he would speak in those ancient halls would carry the hopes and dignity of not just Burkina Faso, but an entire continent that had been systematically dismissed and marginalized by Western academic institutions for centuries. He thought of the brilliant students in Ouagadougou's universities, young minds who could solve complex mathematical theorems or develop innovative agricultural techniques, yet were often dismissed by the global academic establishment simply because of where they were born and the color of their skin. His decision crystallized with the same certainty that had guided him through every revolution he had led, every coup he had survived, and every difficult choice he had made for his people. This wasn't just an invitation to speak at a prestigious university. It was a summons to an intellectual battlefield where ideas would clash like armies and truth would be the ultimate weapon in a war that had been raging for centuries. He reached for his pen, his signature flowing across the acceptance letter with the confidence of a man who had never backed down from a fight, whether against corrupt generals or foreign mining companies. The real question wasn't whether he would go to Cambridge. That decision had been made the moment he read their condescending invitation. The question was whether Cambridge University was truly ready for what Ibrahim Traore had to say, and whether their ivory towers could withstand the earthquake that was coming. As he sealed the envelope, he couldn't shake the feeling that this single piece of paper would change everything, not just for him, but for the relationship between Africa and the West, between the colonized and the colonizers, between those who had been told they were inferior and those who had built their superiority on that lie. The news of Ibrahim Traoré's acceptance spread through Cambridge's ancient halls like wildfire consuming dry autumn leaves, igniting conversations in every corner of the prestigious institution. Professor Edmund Whitfield, the symposium's keynote speaker and Cambridge's most celebrated authority on African affairs, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses as he read the updated program in his oak-paneled office overlooking the River Cam. His lips curled into the condescending smile that had intimidated countless students over his 30-year career, an expression so practiced it seemed permanently etched into his features. "So the African revolutionary thinks he can lecture us on governance," he muttered to his longtime colleague, Dr. Margaret Thornton, who had joined him for their weekly tea and intellectual gossip session. The afternoon light streaming through the Gothic windows seemed to darken as he spoke, as if the universe itself was recoiling from the arrogance in his voice. His office was a monument to academic supremacy, shelves lined with books about primitive societies and developmental economics, awards from institutions across Europe and America, and photographs of him shaking hands with world leaders who had sought his counsel on African affairs. The irony that most of these books had been written by people who had never lived in Africa for more than a few months was lost on their author. Professor Whitfield had built his reputation on observing Africa from the comfortable distance of London conference rooms, treating an entire continent like a laboratory specimen to be studied rather than a complex civilization to be understood. "Edmund, this could be quite the entertainment," Dr. Thornton replied, stirring her Earl Grey tea with the deliberate precision of someone who had never doubted her intellectual superiority. Her own expertise lay in cultural development barriers, a field she had invented to explain why some societies remained backward while others progressed. The faculty lounge that afternoon buzzed with barely concealed excitement and thinly veiled racism as news of the African president's visit circulated among the academic elite. Conversations dropped to conspiratorial whispers whenever African students walked past, but the underlying message was clear. Cambridge was about to witness an educational opportunity to demonstrate Western intellectual superiority. "I wonder if he'll actually understand the questions we pose," whispered Dr. James Blackwood, a political economist who had never set foot in Africa but had written extensively about its economic failures. These revolutionary types tend to rely on emotion rather than data. Professor Whitfield nodded approvingly, already envisioning the patronizing questions he would pose during the Q&A session. His strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Use complex academic language to expose Traoré's lack of formal Western education, then systematically dismantle whatever simplistic arguments the African president might present. He had spent hours crafting questions designed to highlight the supposed contradictions in African socialism and the inevitable failures of anti-Western policies. "I've prepared a comprehensive analysis of Burkina Faso's economic indicators," Whitfield announced to his gathered colleagues. "The poverty rates, infrastructure deficits, and political instability metrics paint a clear picture of leadership inadequacy. When combined with their recent rejection of IMF guidance and World Bank recommendations, it becomes a textbook case of ideological governance over practical solutions." Other academics gathered around his desk, their voices dropping to the tone reserved for discussing laboratory results rather than human lives. They spoke of Ibrahim as if he were a case study rather than a head of state leading 22 million people. Dr. Thornton pulled out her tablet, showing charts and graphs that reduced Burkina Faso's complex history to colorful bar charts and trending lines. "The correlation between anti-Western rhetoric and economic decline is fascinating," she observed, pointing to data that conveniently ignored decades of colonial exploitation and ongoing foreign interference. "It's as if these leaders genuinely believe that emotional appeals can overcome economic realities." The ivory tower's isolation from reality had never been more apparent than in that moment, as brilliant minds applied their considerable intellects to reinforcing their own prejudices rather than seeking genuine understanding. They approached Africa not as scholars seeking truth, but as prosecutors building a case they had already decided. Meanwhile, in the university's administrative offices, panic was setting in among the younger staff members who understood the gravity of the situation developing. Sarah Chen, a graduate student in African Studies, watched the faculty's preparations with growing unease as she organized the symposium materials. Unlike her professors, she had spent significant time in West Africa conducting research for her dissertation on post-colonial economic development. She had witnessed firsthand the transformation occurring in Burkina Faso under Traoré's leadership, how his policies had revolutionized education access, improved food security, and reduced dependency on foreign aid. Her attempts to share these insights with the senior faculty fell on deaf ears, dismissed as the naive observations of someone too young to understand the complexities of African governance. "Professor Whitfield," she had tried explaining earlier that week, "the statistics from Burkina Faso actually show significant improvements in several key metrics since President Traoré took office. Literacy rates are up 23%, local food production has increased by 31%, and they've reduced foreign debt by—" "Miss Chen," Whitfield had interrupted with the patience one might show a confused child. "Statistics can be manipulated to support any narrative. What matters is the broader pattern of African governance failures and the historical precedent of revolutionary movements leading to economic collapse." The disconnect between their academic theories and the reality she had studied was staggering. Sarah knew this symposium would be unlike anything Cambridge had ever experienced. But her warnings were dismissed as the inexperience of someone who hadn't yet learned to separate emotional sympathy from analytical objectivity. Professor Whitfield spent his evening preparing what he believed would be his masterpiece, a presentation designed to expose the fundamental flaws in African governance models with surgical precision. His PowerPoint slides were filled with condescending charts comparing African economies to Western democracies, conveniently omitting historical context about colonial exploitation, imposed borders, and ongoing economic manipulation through international trade agreements. He rehearsed his opening remarks in the mirror of his study, practicing the tone that had made him famous for civilized discourse on uncivilized societies. Each gesture was calculated, each pause designed for maximum impact, each statistic chosen to support his predetermined conclusion that African leaders were fundamentally unprepared for the complexities of modern governance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he practiced, "today we examine the persistent challenges facing African governance in the 21st century. Particularly the tendency toward populist rhetoric over pragmatic policy implementation." His wife Margaret brought him tea as he worked, completely unaware that her husband was preparing for what would become his intellectual Waterloo. She had grown accustomed to his evening preparations for important lectures, proud of his reputation as one of Britain's most respected voices on African affairs. Professor Whitfield's confidence was absolute, built on decades of unopposed authority in academic circles, where his word was treated as gospel truth. He had advised government ministers, consulted for international organizations, and appeared as an expert commentator on BBC and CNN whenever African political crises dominated the news cycle. His book, The Government's Gap: Why Democracy Fails in Developing Nations, sat prominently on bestseller lists and was required reading in political science courses across Europe and North America. Little did he know that his reputation was about to collide with a man who had studied both Marx and Sankara, who understood economic theory not from textbooks, but from trying to feed 22 million people while foreign companies extracted his country's resources. Ibrahim Traoré had overthrown governments with both bullets and brilliance, and he was coming to Cambridge with 23 words that would destroy everything Whitfield represented. The professor fell asleep that night, dreaming of intellectual victory, unaware that he was about to become the face of academic colonialism's final defeat. The memory pulled Ibrahim back 25 years to a dusty evening in his grandfather's compound in Ziniare, where the ancient baobab tree cast protective shadows over their family gathering. The massive tree, estimated to be over 800 years old, had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the coming of colonial masters, and the struggles of independence. Its gnarled roots seemed to hold the secrets of generations, while its enormous trunk bore scars from countless seasons of growth and survival. His grandfather, Ibrahim Traoré, sat on his traditional wooden stool carved from Iroko wood, his weathered hands gesturing as he spoke to 9-year-old Ibrahim about the ways of the world. The crackling fire illuminated the elder's face, each wrinkle telling stories of resistance against colonial masters and their intellectual descendants who had never left, merely changed their tactics from direct rule to cultural domination. "My grandson," the old man had said, his voice carrying the weight of generations and the authority of someone who had lived through the transition from French colonial rule to independence. The white man's greatest weapon was never the gun. It was convincing us that their thoughts were superior to ours. The other village elders nodded in agreement, their eyes reflecting decades of wisdom earned through struggle, survival, and the bitter experience of watching their children educated in schools that taught them to be ashamed of their own heritage. That night, under stars unpolluted by city lights, Ibrahim learned that intellectual warfare required different ammunition than physical battles. It required the courage to speak truth in places where lies had become comfortable. "When they invite you to their table," his grandfather continued, pointing a gnarled finger toward the distant hills where French colonial outposts once stood, "remember that you are not there to beg for scraps from their feast. You are there to remind them where the food on their table came from." The young Ibrahim listened intently, absorbing every word as if his life depended on it, and perhaps it did. His grandfather's stories painted vivid pictures of African scholars who had been dismissed and marginalized by European academics for centuries, brilliant minds whose contributions to philosophy, mathematics, and science had been erased from history books or attributed to others. "They will try to make you feel small with their big words and fancy buildings," the elder warned, his voice growing stronger with each sentence, fed by the righteous anger of someone who had watched his people's accomplishments be systematically denied. The fire crackled louder, as if responding to the intensity of his words. "But remember, our ancestors built universities in Timbuktu when their ancestors were still learning to read and write." The old man stood slowly, his joints protesting against the evening chill, and walked to where Ibrahim sat cross-legged on a hand-woven mat. The boy looked up at his grandfather, with eyes that already showed unusual intelligence and determination, qualities that marked him as someone destined for greatness or tragedy. Often the same thing for African leaders. "Knowledge, true knowledge, comes from understanding your people's pain and finding solutions that work for them," he said, placing his weathered hand on Ibrahim's shoulder. The weight of that touch carried more authority than any university degree ever could, more wisdom than any academic citation, more truth than any peer-reviewed journal. His grandfather's eyes, clouded with age but sharp with intelligence, bore into Ibrahim's soul with the intensity of someone passing on sacred responsibility. When their professors speak, they speak from books written by men who never felt hunger or saw their children die from preventable diseases. They speak of poverty as if it were a mathematical equation to be solved, of governance as if it were a game to be won, of development as if people were resources to be optimized. The other elders murmured their agreement, creating a chorus of ancestral wisdom that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. The sound of traditional drums echoed from distant compounds, weaving together with the old man's words to create a tapestry of resistance and resilience. "When you speak, you carry the voices of millions who trust you with their dreams," his grandfather declared, his hand tightening on Ibrahim's shoulder. "You speak for the mothers who walk 10 kilometers for clean water, for the farmers whose land has been poisoned by foreign mining companies, for the children who learn in schools without books because the books they could afford don't exist in their language." As the fire died to glowing embers, his grandfather delivered the lesson that would shape Ibrahim's approach to every future confrontation, every challenge, every moment when he would be tempted to doubt himself or accept the limitations others tried to place on him. "The most powerful weapon against arrogance is not anger, but truth delivered with such precision that it cuts through lies like a sharp knife through soft butter," the old man said, his voice taking on the quality of a prophecy. "Truth needs no elaborate explanation, no complex justification, no academic credentials. Truth simply is, and when spoken by someone who has lived it, breathed it, and suffered for it, truth becomes unstoppable." Ibrahim felt the weight of responsibility settling on his young shoulders, understanding, even at 9 years old, that he was being prepared for battles he couldn't yet imagine. The old man smiled, seeing the understanding dawn in his grandfather's eyes like sunrise breaking over the savannah. One day you will face men who think their education makes them superior to our wisdom, his grandfather prophesied, his words carried on the night wind like a blessing and a warning combined. The ancestors were watching, and they would not be disappointed. Professor Edmund Whitfield's office was more than a workspace. It was a shrine to intellectual supremacy, its walls lined with awards, honorary degrees, and photographs documenting 3 decades of unopposed authority in African studies. The mahogany-paneled room overlooked Cambridge's ancient courtyards, its Gothic windows filtering light that had illuminated scholars for over 8 centuries. His latest book, The Governance Gap: Why Democracy Fails in Developing Nations, sat prominently displayed on his desk like a monument to Western analytical superiority. For 30 years, Whitfield had built his career on a foundation that seemed unshakable: the premise that Western democratic models represented the pinnacle of human political evolution, while African attempts at self-governance were inherently flawed experiments doomed to failure. His lectures drew packed auditoriums filled with eager students who hung on his every word, never questioning the underlying assumptions that made his theories possible. The professor's influence extended far beyond university walls, reaching into the corridors of real power, where policy decisions affecting millions of lives were made by people who had never set foot in Africa, but trusted Whitfield's expertise implicitly. His frequent appearances on BBC and CNN had made him the go-to commentator whenever African political crises dominated news cycles, his analysis shaping public opinion across Europe and North America. Government officials regularly consulted his published papers when crafting foreign policy toward Africa, treating his theories as gospel truth despite their obvious bias. International development organizations sought his recommendations for aid programs, while think tanks quoted his work in reports that influenced billions of dollars in funding decisions. His voice carried the weight of institutional authority, making his pronouncements seem like objective academic truth rather than the subjective opinions of someone who had never lived the realities he claimed to understand. The irony that his expertise was built on observing Africa from the comfort of London conference rooms seemed lost on his admirers and, more tragically, on Whitfield himself. He had visited the continent perhaps a dozen times in his career, always as part of carefully orchestrated academic delegations that insulated him from genuine contact with ordinary Africans and their daily struggles. Behind the polished exterior and academic credentials, Whitfield harbored beliefs about racial and cultural hierarchy that he carefully disguised in scholarly language. His private conversations with colleagues revealed a man who genuinely believed that Africans lacked the intellectual capacity for sophisticated governance, viewing any success stories as mere anomalies or the result of Western intervention rather than indigenous capability. The problem with African leadership, he had explained to Dr. Thornton during one of their regular tea sessions, is the persistence of tribal mentalities in modern contexts. They simply haven't evolved beyond kinship-based decision-making to embrace rational institutional governance. Such statements, wrapped in academic jargon and delivered with scholarly authority, allowed Whitfield and his colleagues to maintain their prejudices while feeling intellectually sophisticated. They dismissed African philosophers, economists, and political theorists as inferior copies of European thinkers, never acknowledging the rich intellectual traditions that had flourished in Africa for millennia before European contact. His research methodology was masterfully biased, involving the careful selection of data that supported predetermined conclusions while ignoring evidence that contradicted his worldview. When African economies showed improvement, he attributed it to international aid or foreign investment. When they struggled, it proved his theories about indigenous inadequacy. When African leaders succeeded, it was despite their Africanness, not because of it. The professor's blind spots were as vast as his ego, creating a dangerous combination of ignorance and influence that had shaped Western policy toward Africa for decades. His upcoming confrontation with Ibrahim Traoré represented more than an academic debate. It was a collision between centuries of institutionalized racism and the rising voice of African authenticity. As he prepared for the symposium, Whitefield felt the familiar thrill of intellectual dominance, confident that his decades of experience would easily overwhelm this upstart revolutionary from Burkina Faso. He had dealt with African leaders before, usually as guests at Cambridge, who nodded appreciatively at his insights into their own continent, grateful for the opportunity to learn from Western expertise. His strategy for handling Traoré was elegant in its simplicity. Use complex academic language to expose the president's lack of formal Western education, then systematically dismantle whatever simplistic arguments the African leader might present. He had spent hours crafting questions designed to highlight the supposed contradictions in African socialism and the inevitable failures of anti-Western policies. His PowerPoint presentation was loaded with statistics about Burkina Faso's poverty rates and economic challenges, ready to be deployed as intellectual ammunition in what he expected would be a one-sided battle. Charts showing infant mortality rates, literacy rates, and GDP per capita would demonstrate the obvious failures of Traoré's governance, while graphs comparing Burkina Faso unfavorably to Western democracies would illustrate the superiority of established institutional models. The beauty of data, Whitefield had explained to his research assistant while preparing the presentation, is its objectivity. Numbers don't lie, and the numbers clearly show that revolutionary rhetoric is no substitute for proven governance frameworks. What Professor Whitefield didn't realize, what his entire worldview made it impossible for him to comprehend, was that he was preparing to face a man who understood both theory and practice in ways that no ivory tower academic could match. Ibrahim Traoré had studied Marx and Sankara, but more importantly, he had lived their ideas, tested their principles against the harsh realities of leading a nation under siege from the very international system that Whitefield represented. The professor had read about revolutions in books. Ibrahim had led them. The academic had theorized about economic development. Ibrahim had fed hungry people while foreign companies extracted his country's resources. The academic had attended conferences about African governance. The president had actually governed Africans through coups, droughts, and the constant pressure of international interference. As the day of the symposium approached, Whitefield fine-tuned his presentation with the confidence of a surgeon preparing for a routine operation. His colleagues wished him well, eager to witness what they expected would be an educational dismantling of African political pretensions. The academic establishment was about to learn that some truths cannot be defeated by statistics, and some wisdom cannot be challenged by credentials. Professor Whitefield was walking into the most important moment of his career, completely unprepared for what was about to happen to him. The black diplomatic vehicle wound through Cambridge's cobblestone streets as Ibrahim observed the ancient architecture that had witnessed centuries of knowledge, power, and the careful cultivation of intellectual arrogance. Gothic spires pierced the gray English sky, while students in their traditional gowns hurried between lectures, their privilege worn as casually as their expensive scarves and designer shoes. His security detail maintained professional vigilance, but Ibrahim's focus was on the weight of history pressing down upon this moment. He was about to enter halls that had shaped the minds of colonial administrators, imperial architects, and generations of bureaucrats who had carved up Africa with rulers and compasses, treating an entire continent as if it were an empty map waiting to be filled with their ambitions. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same institution that had trained men to exploit Africa was now hosting an African leader who had dedicated his life to breaking those chains. Through the tinted windows, he caught glimpses of protest banners held by African students showing solidarity with his cause. Their presence reminded him that he wasn't alone in this intellectual battlefield. Millions of young Africans were watching, waiting to see their dignity restored in the very heart of the system that had taught them to be ashamed of their heritage. As the convoy approached the university's main entrance, Ibrahim could feel the electric tension in the air. Camera crews from international media outlets lined the pathway, their lenses trained on his vehicle like weapons, waiting to capture any sign of weakness or triumph. The world was watching, and everyone understood that something significant was about to unfold. Inside the main hall, he glimpsed faculty members adjusting their formal robes and checking their notes one final time, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Professor Whitfield stood prominently near the entrance, his chest puffed with the confidence of a man who had never been intellectually challenged on his own turf, surrounded by colleagues who shared his assumption of inevitable victory. The contrast was stark and symbolic. The African president, dressed in a simple but dignified dark suit that cost less than most professors' monthly wine budget, represented the hopes of millions who had been systematically excluded from global discourse. Facing him was an academic establishment draped in centuries of tradition, their elaborate robes and ceremonial regalia designed to intimidate and impress, to remind everyone present of their institutional authority and cultural superiority. The stage was literally and figuratively set for a confrontation that would redefine how the world viewed African leadership, Western academia, and the relationship between knowledge and power. The Great Hall filled with an audience that represented the global power structure. Diplomats whose decisions affected millions of lives, academics whose theories shaped international policy, journalists whose reports influenced public opinion, and students whose futures would be shaped by the ideas exchanged that day. Ibrahim took his seat on the panel with the calm demeanor of someone who had faced down military coups and survived assassination attempts, making their academic theatrics seem suddenly trivial by comparison. His presence seemed to expand beyond his physical form, carrying with it the voices of everyone who had been dismissed, marginalized, and underestimated by rooms exactly like this one. He noticed the skeptical glances, the whispered conversations, and the condescending smiles of faculty members who clearly viewed him as an amusing curiosity rather than a serious intellectual equal. The moderator, a nervous-looking dean, who had suddenly realized he was presiding over something far more significant than a routine academic discussion, shuffled his papers, while Professor Whitfield leaned back in his chair with the casual arrogance of a predator, confident in his prey. The air was thick with expectation and barely concealed racial tension that no amount of academic politeness could disguise. Every person in that hall understood they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered long after they were forgotten, though few could have predicted how dramatically the expected narrative was about to be overturned.
The symposium began with polite introductions and diplomatic pleasantries, but the underlying current of intellectual warfare was palpable to anyone who understood the stakes. Ibrahim listened patiently as various speakers offered their perspectives on African governance, noting how each presentation subtly reinforced narratives of Western superiority and African inadequacy that had been refined over centuries of practice. The audience nodded approvingly at familiar theories about development aid, democratic transitions, and market liberalization, comfortable in their shared assumptions about the continent's limitations and grateful possibilities. These were ideas that had been tested in the real world and found wanting, policies that had failed repeatedly across Africa, yet they were presented as objective truths rather than ideological preferences dressed up as scholarship. Professor Whitfield's moment approached, and Ibrahim could see the man practically salivating at the opportunity to demonstrate his expertise before such a distinguished audience. His colleagues leaned forward with anticipation, while the young African students in the audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing that their president was walking into a carefully orchestrated ambush designed to humiliate not just him, but everything he represented. But Ibrahim remained perfectly still, his eyes sharp and focused, like a lion watching gazelles approach a watering hole. Patient, calculating, and absolutely certain of the outcome that was coming, he drew strength from his grandfather's wisdom and the knowledge that truth, when spoken with conviction at the right moment, could, indeed, change the world. The room fell silent as Professor Edmund Whitfield rose to the podium and history held its breath. Professor Edmund Whitfield rose to the podium with the theatrical flourish of a man accustomed to commanding attention, his academic robes flowing behind him like the wings of an intellectual predator preparing to strike. The PowerPoint screen illuminated behind him as he began his presentation, titled "The African Leadership Paradox: Why Good Intentions Lead to Poor Outcomes," each word carefully chosen to sound analytical rather than accusatory, scholarly rather than supremacist. His opening slide displayed stark statistics about poverty, corruption, and political instability across the continent, presented with the clinical detachment of a surgeon dissecting a corpse. Numbers flashed across the screen: infant mortality rates, literacy percentages, GDP figures, each data point divorced from its historical context, stripped of the colonial legacy that had created many of the problems being diagnosed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of 30 decades in academia and the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged on his own turf. The confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged on his own turf. The audience leaned forward, eager to witness what they anticipated would be an educational dismantling of African political theory. Ibrahim sat motionless, his expression unreadable, as the professor launched into his carefully rehearsed performance. But his mind was processing every word, every assumption, every reveal of the intellectual arrogance that had shaped Western policy toward Africa for generations. Whitfield's presentation methodically attacked every aspect of African self-determination, wrapped in academic language that made his racism seem scholarly and his prejudices appear objective. He spoke of cultural barriers to democratic development and the persistence of tribal mentalities in modern governance, each phrase carefully chosen to sound analytical rather than bigoted, scientific rather than supremacist. His slides showed economic data comparing African nations unfavorably to Western democracies, conveniently omitting historical context about colonial exploitation, imposed borders, resource extraction, and the ongoing economic manipulation through international trade agreements that enriched former colonizers while impoverishing their former colonies.
Ibrahim's gaze finally settled on Professor Whitfield, and for the first time in his academic career, the professor felt like prey rather than predator. The cameras continued rolling, but even the journalists seemed to hold their breath, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in the ongoing struggle between imperial arrogance and African authenticity. When Ibrahim finally spoke, his voice cut through the silence with the precision of a surgical blade, each word carefully chosen and perfectly placed to maximum effect. "Professor Whitfield," he began, his tone carrying the quiet authority of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to command respect, who had learned that true power spoke softly because it didn't need to shout. "You have just provided us with a perfect example of why Africa continues to struggle." The simplicity of his opening caught everyone off guard. No defensive explanations, no angry rebuttals, no academic jargon, just a statement delivered with such confidence that it immediately shifted the power dynamic in the room like a chess move that suddenly revealed the opponent's king was in check. Professor Whitfield's face began to flush as he realized that he was no longer controlling the narrative, that the trap he had set so carefully was somehow being turned against him. The audience leaned forward with renewed interest, sensing that their expectations were about to be completely overturned. Ibrahim paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the hall like morning mist over a battlefield. The next sentence would change everything, and everyone in the room could feel it coming like thunder after lightning. Ibrahim's eyes locked onto Professor Whitfield's with the unwavering intensity of a man who had looked death in the face and emerged victorious, who had seen his comrades fall in battle and his people suffer under foreign exploitation, who carried the weight of history and the hopes of millions in every word he spoke. The hall fell into a silence so profound that the ancient stone walls seemed to lean in to listen, as if the very foundations of Cambridge University understood that history was about to be rewritten in their midst. His voice, when it came, carried the quiet power of thunder rolling across distant mountains, unhurried, inevitable, and absolutely devastating. "The reason Africa struggles, Professor, is not because we reject your solutions, but because we are still cleaning up the mess your solutions created over the past 5 centuries. The words hit the room like a physical force, each syllable precisely calibrated to dismantle not just Whitfield's argument, but the entire intellectual framework that had propped up Western academic superiority for generations. 23 words that contained more truth than Whitfield's 30-year career, more wisdom than his entire institution's library of African studies, more power than all their degrees and honors combined. Professor Whitfield's face drained of color as the implications of that single sentence began to register with crystal clarity. In one devastating moment, Ibrahim had just exposed the fundamental flaw in everything he represented, the convenient amnesia about how the problems he was diagnosing had been created in the first place. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Professor Whitfield's pen dropping onto his notes as his hands began to tremble. Every chart, every statistic, every carefully crafted argument he had presented suddenly looked like evidence for Ibrahim's point rather than against it.
colonial exploitation, structural adjustment programs, imposed borders, extracted resources, puppet governments, economic manipulation, all the solutions that had created the very problems Whitefield was now blaming on African leadership. The audience sat frozen, their minds racing to process how one sentence had just inverted their entire understanding of the conversation, their worldview, their comfortable assumptions about who was responsible for Africa's challenges. The cognitive dissonance was visible on their faces as decades of propaganda crumbled in real time. African students in the crowd began to sit taller, their eyes lighting up with recognition and pride as they witnessed their continent's dignity being restored before their eyes. Finally, someone had said what they had always known but never heard articulated so perfectly in the heart of the imperial beast itself. Meanwhile, faculty members shifted uncomfortably as they realized their intellectual emperor had no clothes, that their expertise was built on foundations of sand, that their entire academic framework was nothing more than elaborate justification for historical crimes they preferred to forget. The cameras continued rolling, capturing the exact moment when decades of academic arrogance met its match in authentic African wisdom. News outlets would struggle to find adequate headlines for what they were witnessing, the intellectual equivalent of David slaying Goliath, except David was an African president and Goliath was the entire Western academic establishment. Ibrahim remained standing, perfectly calm, as if he had just commented on the weather rather than delivered an intellectual death blow that would reverberate around the world. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Truth needs only one sentence to destroy a lifetime of lies. Professor Whitefield's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, his 30 years of authority crumbling in real time, as he struggled to formulate any response that wouldn't further expose his hypocrisy. The irony was crushing. Every rebuttal he could think of would only reinforce Ibrahim's point about Western responsibility for Africa's challenges, while remaining silent would confirm his intellectual defeat. The professor tried to speak, his voice cracking as he began. "But surely you must acknowledge that—" "Contemporary challenges?" interrupted Ibrahim, his voice still calm but now carrying an edge that silenced the professor immediately. "Professor, when your mining companies poison our water, when your agricultural policies destroy our food sovereignty, when your debt structures drain our resources, when your military interventions destabilize our regions, these are not African problems requiring Western solutions. These are Western problems requiring African solutions." The second blow was even more devastating than the first, expanding on the initial truth with surgical precision. Ibrahim wasn't just defending African leadership, he was indicting the entire system that Whitefield represented, exposing the circular logic that created problems and then blamed the victims for failing to solve them. His colleagues in the front row avoided eye contact, suddenly finding their programs fascinating, as they realized they were witnessing the public destruction of one of their most prominent voices. The academic food chain that had sustained Western intellectual superiority for generations was being devoured before their eyes. The moderator looked panic-stricken, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment play out, while journalists frantically typed notes and adjusted cameras to capture every nuance of Whitefield's complete intellectual collapse. The professor's reputation, built over decades of unchallenged proclamations, was evaporating like morning dew under the African sun. Dr. Thornton, Whitfield's longtime colleague, watched in horror as the man she had respected for decades was reduced to a stammering shadow of his former self. The comfortable world of academic conferences and scholarly publications, where their theories went unchallenged, suddenly seemed very far away from this moment of reckoning. Students throughout the hall began to whisper urgently, some pulling out phones to record and share what they were witnessing. The viral moment was already beginning, though none of them could predict how far and fast it would spread or how completely it would transform global discourse about Africa and the West. Ibrahim's revolution had come not with guns or armies, but with truth spoken simply and without apology. The power of his words lay not in their complexity, but in their undeniable accuracy, their ability to cut through centuries of carefully constructed lies with the precision of a master surgeon. The immediate aftermath of Ibrahim's response created a ripple effect that spread through the great hall like cracks in breaking ice. The carefully constructed narrative that had dominated Western discourse about Africa for centuries was collapsing in real time, and everyone present could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. Professor Whitfield sat slumped in his chair. His academic robes, that once symbolized authority, now looked like the costume of a dethroned emperor. His PowerPoint slides, still glowing behind him on the massive screen, now looked like exhibits in a museum of colonial delusion rather than cutting-edge academic analysis. Each statistic he had presented with such confidence now served as evidence for Ibrahim's argument rather than his own. The professor's breathing had become shallow and rapid, his face cycling through shades of red as the full magnitude of his public humiliation settled upon him like a burial shroud. He had walked into this room as one of the world's most respected voices on African affairs and had been reduced to intellectual rubble by a man he had dismissed as primitive. Dr. Margaret Thornton watched her colleague's destruction with a mixture of horror and fascination, suddenly understanding that her own career built on similar assumptions was equally vulnerable. The theories they had spent decades developing, the books they had written, the conferences they had dominated, all of it was built on the same foundational lie that Ibrahim had just exposed with surgical precision. Students throughout the hall began pulling out their phones, fingers flying across screens as they shared clips of the exchange that would soon explode across social media platforms worldwide. The hashtags were already forming. Hashtag Ibrahim Destroys, hashtag One Sentence Revolution, hashtag Cambridge Reckoning, hashtag Africa Answers Back. The viral tsunami was beginning, and within hours, the clip would be viewed by millions of people who had been waiting their entire lives to see Western academic arrogance confronted so decisively. African universities would organize viewing parties, students gathering to watch their continent's dignity being restored in the very heart of the Imperial Academy. Meanwhile, the moderator struggled to regain control of a symposium that had transformed from academic discussion into historical reckoning. His carefully planned schedule was in ruins, his distinguished panel in chaos, his institution's reputation hanging by a thread as cameras captured every moment of their intellectual collapse. "Perhaps we should, move to questions from the audience," he stammered, desperately seeking escape from the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the hall like fog over a battlefield. But Ibrahim wasn't finished. The lion had tasted blood, and there was more prey to be taken down. "I welcome questions," he said, his voice carrying across the hall with the confidence of someone who had just proven he could handle anything they could throw at him. His grandfather had taught him that when fighting for dignity, politeness was often just another form of submission. A hand shot up from the audience, a young African student from Oxford who had driven to Cambridge specifically to witness this historic moment. "President Traoré," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "what would you say to young Africans who have been taught to believe that Western education and Western systems are superior to our own traditions and knowledge?" Ibrahim's expression softened as he looked at the young woman, seeing in her the millions of African children who had been programmed to hate themselves by the very education system that was supposed to liberate them. "Sister," he said, using the traditional African term of kinship that immediately established connection and equality, "I would tell you that the greatest tragedy of colonialism was not the theft of our resources, but the theft of our confidence in ourselves." The room was absolutely silent now, everyone hanging on every word he uttered. They convinced us that our languages were inferior, our knowledge primitive, our ways of governing backward. But ask yourself this: how can the people who created the problems be the only ones capable of solving them? How can the systems that enriched themselves through our poverty be the systems that will lead us to prosperity? Professor Whitfield made one last desperate attempt to reassert his authority, his voice barely above a whisper. "But surely development aid and international cooperation—" "Aid!" Ibrahim cut him off, his voice now carrying the full weight of his anger and his people's suffering. "Professor, your aid is like a man who steals your bicycle and then offers to rent it back to you. Your cooperation is like a partnership between a horse and its rider. We know who carries the burden and who enjoys the ride." The metaphor hit like a thunderbolt, so simple and perfect that even the most stubborn academics couldn't deny its truth. Foreign aid that came with conditions that benefited the donors more than the recipients, international cooperation that somehow always seemed to leave Africa holding the short end of every stick. The intellectual massacre was complete. Professor Whitfield's career was over, his reputation destroyed, his life's work revealed as elaborate justification for continued exploitation. But more importantly, a door had been opened that could never be closed again. The door to authentic African voices claiming their rightful place in global discourse. As the symposium officially ended, the real work was just beginning. The clip would spread across the internet like wildfire, viewed by millions and shared billions of times. World leaders would be forced to watch it. Academics would be forced to confront it. And a new generation of Africans would be inspired by it. The revolution had come not with bullets, but with 23 words of devastating truth, and the world would never be the same. Within 6 hours of the symposium's conclusion, the clip of Ibrahim's response had been viewed over 10 million times across various social media platforms. The algorithmic gods of the internet, recognizing viral content when they saw it, pushed the video to trending status on Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook simultaneously. In Accra, students at the University of Ghana gathered in the main auditorium to watch the exchange on the big screen, erupting in thunderous applause as Ibrahim delivered his devastating response. Similar scenes played out across African universities, from Makerere in Uganda to the University of Cape Town in South Africa, from Cairo's Al-Azhar to Dakar's Sheikh Anta Diop University. Dr. Amina Cohn, a brilliant economist at the University of Nairobi who had spent years having her research dismissed by Western journals, watched the clip with tears streaming down her face. For the first time in her career, she felt validated, vindicated, and hopeful that African scholarship might finally receive the respect it deserved. "This is what we've been waiting for," she told her colleagues as they gathered around her laptop. "Someone finally said what we've all been thinking for decades." The reaction in Western academic circles was swift and brutal. Within hours of the clip going viral, Professor Whitfield's university email was flooded with thousands of messages ranging from scholarly criticism to outright condemnation. Students began organizing protests, demanding explanations for how someone with such obviously biased views had been allowed to shape African studies for so long. The Cambridge University administration went into full crisis mode. Emergency meetings were called, press statements were drafted and redrafted, and damage control specialists were brought in to manage what was quickly becoming an international incident. The university's reputation, built over 8 centuries, was under assault from a single video clip that exposed the intellectual bankruptcy at the heart of their African Studies program. Professor Whitfield himself had retreated to his office, watching his life's work crumble as resignation letters poured in from editorial boards and academic committees. Publishing houses that had profited from his books began receiving angry calls from readers demanding refunds and explanations. Speaking engagements were canceled. Honorary positions were revoked, and colleagues who had once sought his counsel now avoided him like a plague carrier. But the real impact was being felt far beyond academic circles. In Washington, D.C., State Department officials found themselves fielding urgent calls from African embassies demanding explanations for how American foreign policy toward Africa had been influenced by someone whose biases had been so thoroughly exposed. The World Bank quietly convened emergency meetings to review their African development programs, suddenly realizing that their entire approach might need fundamental restructuring if they wanted to maintain any credibility. International Monetary Fund officials watched the clip with growing unease, understanding that their structural adjustment programs were now viewed through the lens of Ibrahim's devastating critique. In corporate boardrooms across Europe and North America, executives from mining companies, agricultural conglomerates, and financial institutions scrambled to assess how the viral moment might impact their African operations. The comfortable narrative that had justified their extraction of wealth from the continent was crumbling, replaced by uncomfortable questions about historical responsibility and contemporary exploitation. News outlets that had regularly featured Whitfield as an expert commentator on African affairs quietly scrubbed his appearances from their websites and began desperately seeking authentic African voices to fill the void. CNN, BBC, Reuters, and other major networks found themselves confronting their own complicity in amplifying voices that had no legitimate claim to expertise about Africa. The clip crossed linguistic barriers as translations appeared in French, Arabic, Portuguese, Swahili, Hausa, and dozens of other languages. In Francophone Africa, students in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Senegal organized watch parties that turned into celebration rallies. In North Africa, the video sparked renewed discussions about Pan-African unity and the need to reclaim African narratives from Western interpreters. Young Africans in the diaspora felt a surge of pride they hadn't experienced since childhood. Kofi Asante, a graduate student at Harvard who had spent years being the only African voice in his classes, watched the clip and immediately changed his thesis topic to focus on decolonizing international relations theory. "I've been trying to explain this to my professors for 3 years," he told his roommate. "Ibrahim did it in 23 words. The African Union called an emergency session to discuss how to capitalize on the moment, while individual African governments began reassessing their relationships with Western academic institutions and development organizations. The comfortable post-colonial arrangements that had kept Africa intellectually subordinated to the West were suddenly under unprecedented scrutiny. In Burkina Faso itself, the response was electric. Radio stations played the clip on repeat, while television networks organized panel discussions featuring local intellectuals who had been marginalized by the international academic establishment. Citizens poured into the streets not in protest, but in celebration, proud that their president had restored their dignity on the world stage. Traditional chiefs and village elders, many of whom had never seen the inside of a university, understood instinctively what Ibrahim had accomplished. He had spoken truth to power in a way that honored their ancestors and vindicated their wisdom, proving that formal education was no substitute for lived experience and cultural knowledge. The viral moment had achieved something that decades of academic conferences, scholarly papers, and diplomatic initiatives had failed to accomplish. It had fundamentally shifted the global conversation about Africa from one dominated by outside observers to one where African voices were finally being heard and respected. 6 months after that historic day at Cambridge, the reverberations of Ibrahim's 23 words had fundamentally altered the landscape of global academic and political discourse. The world had witnessed the intellectual execution of centuries of colonial thinking, broadcast live and archived forever in the digital memory of human civilization. Professor Edmund Whitfield had quietly resigned from his position, his departure barely noted in the academic journals that had once celebrated his work. His former colleagues maintained a careful distance, understanding that association with his now toxic reputation could damage their own careers. The man who had once been considered Cambridge's leading authority on African affairs had become an intellectual pariah, a cautionary tale about the dangers of building expertise on foundations of prejudice. His office, once a shrine to Western academic supremacy, was being cleaned out by maintenance staff who treated his books and awards like contaminated materials. The irony was complete. The man who had spent his career treating Africans as objects of study had become an object lesson himself. Cambridge University had quietly restructured its entire African Studies department, recruiting scholars from the continent itself rather than relying on Western interpretations of African realities. The new department head, Dr. Fatma Okoye from Nigeria, had announced that the program would focus on amplifying African voices rather than interpreting them through Western frameworks. Similar transformations were occurring at universities across Europe and North America. The viral clip had become required viewing in political science, international relations, and African studies courses worldwide, serving as a perfect example of how entrenched biases could masquerade as objective scholarship for generations. Young African intellectuals, who had once felt marginalized in global conversations, now found their voices amplified and their perspectives actively sought by institutions that had previously ignored them. The intellectual revolution that Ibrahim had sparked was reshaping how the world understood power, knowledge, and the relationship between the West and Africa. International development organizations had begun hiring African economists and policy experts to lead programs that had traditionally been designed by Western consultants with little understanding of local contexts. The World Bank had restructured its African Advisory Board, while the International Monetary Fund faced unprecedented pressure to examine how its structural adjustment programs had contributed to the very problems they claimed to solve. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim watched these global changes with quiet satisfaction while continuing to focus on the practical work of building his nation. The international attention had brought new investment opportunities and partnerships based on mutual respect rather than paternalistic charity. More importantly, it had given voice to millions of Africans who had been waiting for someone to articulate their frustration with Western condescension. Universities across the continent reported record enrollment as young people sought education that would prepare them to continue the intellectual revolution Ibrahim had sparked. His grandfather's grave in their village compound had become an unofficial pilgrimage site where visitors left flowers and notes of gratitude, recognizing the ancestral wisdom that had prepared Ibrahim for his moment of destiny. Standing there in the early morning light, feeling the weight of responsibility and the satisfaction of promises kept to both the living and the dead, Ibrahim often reflected on the power of truth spoken simply and directly. His grandfather's teachings about the courage required to speak honestly in places where lies had become comfortable had been vindicated on the world stage in ways the old man could never have imagined. The lasting impact of those 23 words continued to unfold in ways that surprised even Ibrahim himself. African students who had felt ashamed of their continental identity now wore it with pride. Western students began demanding more authentic perspectives in their curricula. Children in African schools learned that intellectual courage could be as powerful as military might in the struggle for dignity and recognition. The clip had become a teaching tool, a rallying cry, and a symbol of what was possible when authentic voices challenged entrenched power structures. It proved that the pen could indeed be mightier than the sword, especially when wielded by someone who understood both the weight of history and the power of truth. As Ibrahim stood on the balcony of his modest presidential office, watching the sunrise paint the sky above Ouagadougou in shades of hope, he knew that his grandfather would be proud. The hyena's invitation to dinner had indeed backfired spectacularly, and the lion had brought exactly the right meat to the feast. The intellectual revolution was complete, but the work of building a better world was just beginning. 23 words had changed everything, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapons are not bullets or bombs, but truth spoken with conviction at exactly the right moment.